You're here now. And maybe that already means something. Maybe you've always felt it like a quiet itch in the back of your mind. That the stories you were told in school weren't lies, but they weren't quite whole either. That the real America wasn't found in multiple-choice answers or textbook timelines, but in the spaces between them in the pages that were never printed. There are cities beneath your highways, names erased from marble, dreams written in languages this country chose to forget, and some truths. Some truths were so inconvenient. They were buried under silence, not to erase them, but to hope you'd stop asking. But tonight, you ask. Not with anger, not with noise, but with something much stronger: curiosity and care. Tonight, you listen, not for guilt, but for connection. To the mothers and laborers, the dreamers and fighters, the ones whose stories still float like dust in our archives, waiting for someone, maybe you, to breathe them back. So, let your shoulders fall. Let the lights dim behind your eyes. You don't need to take notes or prove anything. Just follow the sound. And if a name or moment stirs something in you, feel free to whisper it back in the comments. We're not just remembering history. We're remembering ourselves. Now, we begin. Section 1. Before Columbus, native cities of stone and light. A civilization of 100,000 people thrived in North America long before 1492. You close your eyes and find yourself standing in the middle of a city that no one ever told you existed. Not Tenochtitlan, not Machu Picchu. This one is closer, much closer. Just across the Mississippi River from what today is St. Louis, Missouri. But the year is not 1492. It is 1100 AD, and you are surrounded by light. Not electric light, not firelight, but the light of order of vision. Broad plazas stretch before you, surrounded by dozens, no, hundreds of man-made earthen pyramids. At the center stands a massive mound, taller than a 10-story building. You feel the pull of it, like a cathedral built from earth. And all around it, movement, noise, trade, worship, children, smoke from ceremonial fires. You are standing in Cahokia, a city of 100,000 human souls, in a time and place where most Americans believe nothing was here. But something was here. Something magnificent. And no one ever told you. The textbooks taught you that native peoples were scattered, tribal, nomadic. They gave you feathers and canoes, teepees and totems. They did not give you cities. They did not give you astronomy. They did not give you this. Cahokia was urban. It had zoning, neighborhoods, public gathering centers, and even a wood henge, a ring of cedar posts aligned with the solstices, functioning as a calendar as sophisticated as any in Europe. Its main mound, known today as Monk's Mound, covered more than 14 acres and required millions of baskets of soil to build. No machines, no horses, just hands and generations of memory. It was larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza in terms of base area. This was not a village. This was a city-state. At its peak, Cahokia was larger than London. Its population rivaled Paris and Venice, and its people were not passive. They were engineers of earth and sky. They moved rivers. They redirected trade. They built temples aligned with the stars, and political systems aligned with the seasons. You wander deeper. There are cornfields in every direction. The corn isn't wild, it's cultivated. engineered over centuries to survive the harsh Mississippi floodplains. Traders arrive on river canoes carrying shells from the Gulf of Mexico, copper from the Great Lakes, obsidian from the Rockies. A spiritual and economic network stretches across thousands of miles, and this city is its beating heart. But who lived here? And where did they go? That's when you realize something else they never told you. We don't know. Cahokia collapsed. Silently. By 1350, the city was empty. The mounds remained, but the people did not. Theories ripple like ghosts: climate collapse, overpopulation, war, soil exhaustion, social upheaval. No one agrees. No one can. Because no written records remain. Because their stories were spoken, not stored. And the colonists who arrived 200 years later burned what was left and built over the rest. There are suburbs now, parking lots, strip malls, highways. But underneath them, if you listen closely, you can still hear the geometry of a vanished civilization. You pause here. Maybe this is the first time anyone ever told you that America had a metropolis, a capital of mound builders and sky watchers, builders of wooden monuments more precise than Stonehenge, a city that lived, breathed, danced, and then was forgotten. But now you remember, and the memory remembers you. Section 2. The Real Story of Thanksgiving. Beyond the Classroom. Myth. What happened between settlers and native nations was more survival and politics than holiday peace. You've heard this story before, haven't you? The feast, the gratitude, the shared corn and wild turkey under the autumn sun, the pilgrims in black hats, the Native Americans in feathers, a moment of harmony. It's neat. It's comforting. And it's mostly fiction. Let's peel it back. In 1620, the English settlers we call the Pilgrims arrived at a coast they named Plymouth. But this wasn't virgin land. For over 10,000 years, the Wampanoag people had lived on this shore, farming, fishing, and building complex trade networks that stretched across what we now call New England. Their lands were not empty. They were grieving. Just a few years before the Mayflower arrived, an epidemic likely brought by earlier European traders had swept through Wampanoag territory, killing nearly 90% of their people. Entire villages were reduced to silence. Massasoit, the Wampanoag Sachem leader, faced an uncertain future. His enemies, the Narragansett to the west, had not suffered the same devastation. His people were vulnerable. The Pilgrims were not saviors. They were a political opportunity. You might imagine that the famous first Thanksgiving was a planned gathering of goodwill. But the actual 1621 event was probably more of a diplomatic exchange. After the English fired their guns in celebration of a successful harvest, the nearby Wampanoag sent 90 men to investigate, possibly thinking war had broken out. What they found was a feast, and they contributed 5 deer to it. There were no pies. There were no mashed potatoes. There may not have even been turkey. It wasn't called Thanksgiving. That term was reserved for days of fasting and prayer. In the 1600s, a Thanksgiving was a somber religious event, not a dinner party. The Wampanoag did not wear feathered headdresses like we see in school plays. And the Pilgrims didn't wear black buckled hats. That's pure costume. Most importantly, the harmony of that moment didn't last. In the decades that followed, peace unraveled. English settlers expanded aggressively, seizing land, breaking treaties, and insisting that native peoples submit to colonial authority. By the 1670s, war came. King Philip's War, named after Massasoit's son, Metacom, known to the English as King Philip, was one of the bloodiest conflicts in American history. Per capita, Metacom had once eaten at the Englishman's tables. Now, he fought to protect what was left of his people's land and way of life. He was killed, dismembered, and his head was placed on a pike in Plymouth for over 20 years as a warning. And yet, school children still make hand turkeys and wear pilgrim hats every November. But some do remember. Since 1970, Native Americans and their allies have gathered at Plymouth Rock on Thanksgiving Day to mark a national day of mourning. They speak the names. They walk the land. They tell the story as it really happened. And now, you know it too. Let that knowledge settle quietly, like snow falling on ancient ground. This isn't a story of villains or heroes. It's a story of survival, a story of choices. And like most of American history, it's more complicated and more human than we were taught to believe. So, next time you sit at a table and say thanks, remember what was lost and what still endures. Because not everything sacred makes it into the textbooks. Section 3. Slavery in the North. Yes, it happened. New York and Boston didn't just oppose slavery. They profited from it. Close your eyes for a moment and picture the word slavery. What comes to mind? Cotton fields in Mississippi, plantations in Georgia, shackles, whips, the Deep South. The imagery is powerful and geographically narrow. But here's the quiet truth they don't whisper in school books. The North, too, was built with chains. Slavery didn't skip New England. It wasn't just a Southern sin. In the early 1600s, just decades after Jamestown, enslaved Africans were being bought and sold on the docks of Boston. Children, women, and men were auctioned next to barrels of molasses and crates of tobacco. Ads for Negro boys ran in the Boston Gazette. Ministers owned people. Universities profited. The North was never a bystander. Walk through the cobbled streets of Newport, Rhode Island, and you're walking on what was once the rum capital of the world, part of a triangle trade that moved molasses from the Caribbean, rum from New England, and enslaved people from West Africa. It was a closed loop of human misery. New York. In the 1700s, more enslaved Africans lived in New York City than in Charleston, South Carolina. Wall Street. Yes, that Wall Street began as a literal wall built by enslaved labor. When George Washington took his oath of office there in 1789, enslaved servants waited just out of frame, and Boston abolitionist sermons came later. First came profits. Merchants insured slave ships. Wealthy families built generational fortunes from investments in southern plantations and Caribbean sugar fields. Harvard and Yale, revered halls of learning, accepted donations, funded by slave economies. Ivory towers often have foundations of silence. Even after northern states began gradual emancipation in the late 1700s, many allowed slavery to persist for decades. New Jersey didn't fully abolish slavery until 1865, the same year the 13th Amendment passed. In the census just before that, hundreds of black people were still legally enslaved in northern households. We like to draw sharp lines in history. North good, South bad. But lines blur when money speaks. So, why don't we talk about it? Because forgetting is convenient. Because it's easier to believe that morality won the day, not profit. Because some stories are quietly erased, not with fire, but with absence. But the past leaves echoes. They live in street names, endowments, ledgers, and whispered family heirlooms. They live in the bricks of old banks and the shadows of lecture halls. The North may not have harvested the cotton, but it spun the profits into silk. And now, you remember. Let the remembering be soft, not bitter. Let it settle into the folds of your understanding like warm linen. You're not here to carry guilt, only truth. And with truth comes clarity, quiet, and rest. Section 4. The wealth built by enslaved people that still shapes America. Universities, banks, and elite families still carry the inheritance of forced labor. There's a kind of silence that doesn't come from forgetting, but from being taught never to ask. And so, for generations, few asked where did the money come from. The mansions that line the East Coast, the old banks with marble floors, the Ivy League schools with billion-dollar endowments, the quiet family names etched in museum plaques and trust funds. Where did it all begin? The answer lies in backs bent beneath sun and whip. It began with stolen bodies and stolen time, with enslaved children who never played, with women who gave birth in chains, and men who planted sugar, rice, indigo, tobacco, and cotton until their hands split. The profits of their labor weren't merely Southern. They flowed north into investment houses, shipping companies, church coffers, and university accounts. Insurance firms in Connecticut sold policies to plantation owners not for crops, but for enslaved human lives. If someone died in bondage, the plantation would be compensated. Banks in New York offered loans to purchase people, using human beings as collateral. Brokerage houses in Rhode Island shipped rum to Africa, brought back slaves to the Caribbean, then returned to New England with molasses. It was all ledgered, all legal, all profitable. And then the profits did what wealth does: they multiplied. They built lecture halls and chapels. They seeded railroads and factories. They created dynasties. Harvard, Princeton, Yale, their early benefactors traded in human lives. Some presidents of these schools owned slaves themselves. Donations from slave traders were accepted without question. Libraries were named after families who trafficked in flesh. The names may be familiar: Brown, DeWolf, Calhoun. They sit atop buildings and legal foundations. They shape the skyline and the syllabi. Even after slavery was abolished, the wealth persisted. It passed from father to son, from estate to institution. It grew interest. It built pensions. It printed history books that said slavery was a Southern matter, while the North and its capital rested comfortably on the profits. This isn't a tale of villainy. It's a tale of omission, of silence passed like heirloom silver. And maybe that's the softest betrayal, the forgetting. That something so vast, so brutal, so foundational could be hidden in plain sight. That the weight of stolen centuries could be tucked behind velvet curtains and etched into gold without mention of the hands that bled to earn it. But you, lying still now in the dark, are remembering, not with anger, not with blame, just with clarity. A slow, gentle reckoning, the kind that doesn't shout but hums like a lullaby passed down through forgotten voices. Wealth moves forward, but so does truth. And in the quiet, the echoes are beginning to speak. Section 5. Trail of Tears. A walk through government-sanctioned erasure. Entire native nations were forced westward by law, on foot, in cold and silence. You hear the wind before the footsteps. It's thin and gray, whispering through the trees. Cold, not just from winter, but from something older, something carved into the land, and then forgotten. A trail, not one marked with signs or stories, but with silence. You walk it now, in your mind, with the thousands who once walked it with their feet, not for pilgrimage, not for trade, but because the government said they had to go. They were the Cherokee, the Muskogee, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Seminole. Nations with governments, newspapers, written constitutions, children who went to school, farmers who planted corn, held land in title, prayed in churches, and spoke English and their mother tongues. And yet, they were told they did not belong. Not anymore. It began with ink, not with bullets. A signature in 1830, the Indian Removal Act, signed by President Andrew Jackson, a man who once called Native people children and savages in the same breath. Congress passed it. Many cheered it. The U.S. Supreme Court opposed its abuse and Jackson ignored them. There were treaties. There were lies. There were deals made at gunpoint and on paper soaked with broken promises. The Cherokee resisted in courts. They won. And still, the army came. In the winter of 1838, thousands of soldiers began to round them up, men, women, infants, elders. They came into homes and burned crops. They took people from dinner tables. They forced entire towns into holding pens called emigration depots. The largest was a military stockade in Chattanooga. From there, they began the march 200 miles to Oklahoma. They called it Nuna Daul Isunyi, the trail where they cried. The name wasn't poetic. It was real. Children froze in blankets that were too thin. Elders collapsed from hunger. Women gave birth in wagons and were forced to keep walking. People ate roots and boiled leather. Bodies were buried shallow. Sometimes not at all. More than 4,000 Cherokee died, nearly 1 in every 4 who set out. For the other tribes, the numbers were similar. Whole villages vanished. Whole languages began to thin out. One grandmother at a time. Some still think of it as a relocation. But this wasn't moving. This was erasure by policy, cleansing by law. And when they reached Oklahoma, it was not over. The land was poor. The promises of government support evaporated in bureaucracy. Tribal governments tried to rebuild. They printed newspapers again, opened schools, resurrected old ceremonies in new soil. But the grief, it lingered like cold smoke. What is lost when a people are moved not just from their homes, but from the bones of their ancestors, from the sacred rivers, the old trees, the invisible lines that tie memory to earth? America rarely asked. In textbooks, the Trail of Tears became a paragraph, maybe a map, maybe a sentence on a test. As if walking through snow with children dying beside you could be summarized with the phrase, forced westward migration. The land, meanwhile, was quickly filled. White settlers claimed the homes the Cherokee had built. Cotton plantations rose. Railroads stretched their arms across stolen valleys. The United States did not mourn, but the people remembered. And memory doesn't die quietly. It sings. Today, some walk the trail again, not in chains, but in ceremony. Descendants of the survivors gather each year to honor the steps, the names, the untold. They walk the path that their great-great-grandmothers were forced to walk. They cry. They sing. They carry medicine. They bring their children, and they tell the truth. We are still here, because even when a government tries to erase a people, it cannot erase their breath, their stories, their drums, their dreams. So tonight, as you lie in the stillness, listen, the footsteps are still there. So is the wind. So are the names, not in history books, perhaps, but in the soil, in the stars, in you. Section 6. The black cowboys who helped build the West one in 4 Cowboys was black, but movies rode past them. You drift back in time, to dusty trails under endless skies. The sun is low, aglow on hooves and spurs, and you feel the rhythm of a life that textbooks never taught you. Here, on these plains, a black man reigns in front of you, strong, quiet, skilled, not in a Hollywood role, but as part of the fabric of the frontier. Believe it or not, about 1 in 4 cowboys in the late 1800s was black. It's a truth that's easy to miss, hidden beneath myths of white hats and lone rangers. But the truth rides just ahead of the legend, in stories passed down by the wind after the Civil War. As fields lay bare and bonds were broken, many formerly enslaved men headed west. On Texas ranches, they discovered something new. Skill meant survival, not color. A talented horse handler or cow wrangler was valued. Life on the trail didn't care for your past. It cared about what you did from dawn till dusk. Imagine a trail crew, 7 white hands, 3 black, perhaps a Mexican or 2. The black cowboy might be the cook stirring the beans, or the horse wrangler taming the wildest stallion. Maybe he was the top hand, leading the herd, or the lone voice singing low by the campfire. Either way, his abilities shaped the journey. They rode fearless horses across Texas, Kansas, Oklahoma. They guided thousands of cattle, crossing rivers and plains. They faced weather and rustlers. They built communities, served as guides, and some even rode the law like Bass Reeves, a former slave who became one of the first black U.S. Marshals west of the Mississippi. He arrested thousands and hunted infamous outlaws, riding with dignity and steel. You may not have heard his name on screen, but he may have inspired the Lone Ranger himself. Then there was Bill Pickett, a cowboy so legendary he invented bulldogging. He would leap from his horse to wrestle steers to the ground by their horns. His act awed crowds across Texas, Oklahoma, and the world. He toured with Wild West shows and appeared in early silent films. Soon, rodeos inducted him into their halls of fame. But he was never just a novelty. He was exceptional. Along these trails, black cowboys built the American West, handling horses, setting up ranches, competing in rodeos, and weaving culture into rodeo songs, dances, and attire. Yet when Hollywood began spinning cowboy stories, they erased them. Movie posters showed only white figures, spurs gleaming under a white sun. Bankers bought the legend. Cowboys got buried by it, but the spirit persisted. In places like Philadelphia, urban neighborhoods kept horse culture alive with stables and the Fletcher Street Riding Club. In Compton, California, riders formed an equestrian brotherhood riding through city streets, defying stereotypes. keeping traditions beating in the heart of the city. It wasn't just nostalgia. It was resistance. It was saying, "We are still here." They rode in solidarity during protests, led youth programs, and appeared in fashion campaigns like Dao Black Yeehaw Agenda. In museums and galleries across the country, exhibitions finally began to tell the full story not as footnotes, but as central voices of the American epic. Their blood and courage shaped ranches, rodeos, frontier towns, and the very idea of the cowboy. They tamed wild horses, stitched rawhide saddles, and sung lullabies to restless herds. They lived under open sky and lived under unspoken racism, earning respect with skill, not waiting for justice. You feel their absence when you watch old westerns. You feel it when the screen stays silent about their names, their lives, their grit. Tonight, you let that silence break. You breathe in their presence and let their stories fill the quiet. The trail is not empty. It hums with bridles, bones, voices, with Bass Reeves taking down outlaws, with Bill Pickett wrestling bulls, with Compton cowboys riding for hope. Imagine now that low whistle of wind through Maines. Let the memory ride across your mind. You are settling into sleep, but you carry their footsteps into your quiet. Because the West wasn't built with white hands alone. It was built in communion with black hearts, black skill, black endurance, and their legacy still rides ahead of us today. Section 7. The Real Tulsa, a burning city of black wealth. In 1921, a thriving black community was destroyed, and history stayed quiet for nearly a century. You wake one morning to smoke drifting in from the horizon. It smells of burned wood, scorched earth, and broken promises. You follow the acrid haze toward Greenwood, Tulsa, a place once called Black Wall Street. By 1921, this was more than a neighborhood. It was a self-made city. Quiet boulevards lined with brick buildings, thriving black-owned businesses, banks, hotels, newspapers, pharmacies, movie theaters, a library, even private airplanes, doctors, lawyers, teachers. Wealth built from sweat, ambition, talent, and determination. Despite the color of their skin, they had carved success in a world determined to deny it. They had carved dignity where none seemed possible. They had carved joy where others saw only struggle. Some Americans called it an anomaly. Many black Tulsans called it home. And then in one violent night, it was all erased. You see a knock at the door, a rumor, a confrontation. A white mob forms. They walk in. They shoot. They drag people from their homes. They burn. Houses catch fire. Businesses go up in flame. People are thrown from rooftops. Families run blind in the smoke. Mothers clutch children. Fathers wrestle looting mobs. Elderly collapse. The sky over Tulsa turns red, then black. The city's own police stand aside or join in. Aerial observers in private planes drop incendiaries on homes below. Temples of black wealth are leveled in hours. And the Tulsa Daily World. The black newspaper documents it all. They report burned churches, burned ambulances, burned hospitals, 70 or 75 blocks razed, at least 10,000 forced into tents or homeless on streets. Death toll estimates range from 100 to 300, though official tallies list far fewer. Overnight, Greenwood's dream was charred. Then the silence came. Mainstream Tulsa refused to talk about it. There were no trials for the arsonists, no reparations, no memorials for decades. Authorities blamed the victims, calling it a race riot, not a massacre, a riot, an anomaly, a mistake that didn't deserve investigation. Black Tulsans rebuilt, but the city fought them. White landlords raised rents. Banks refused loans. Insurance claims were denied. Zoning decisions edged Greenwood farther from the city center, burying it physically and historically. Years later, scholars and activists would find third-grade textbooks that skipped the chapter entirely. Not omitted by mistake. Removed. The story wasn't just erased. It was denied. But stories, unlike walls, crumble slowly. In the 1970s, community members walked the charred footprints, pointing at invisible foundations and silent sidewalks. In the 1990s, students began demanding investigations. How many died? Where did they sleep? What happened to the people? In 2001, the first memorial began. Then, an honest state commission. Finally, victims were awarded reparations far too late, and still far too little. Greenwood district businesses began returning. Museums opened. The Greenwood Rising Center stands as a phoenix of memory and hope. You close your eyes again and imagine that Greenwood before 1921 thrived under the wide Oklahoma sky. A black-owned bank offers mortgages. A black-owned flight school trains pilots. Black architects design buildings on Greenwood Avenue. Mothers shop in fine boutiques. Children go to school and talk about their future. Life hums with possibility. You step into a barber shop. You smell hair pomade, bourbon, the afternoon sun through windows. The barber hums a jazz tune while trimming hair. Outside, the doorbell jingles a banker, an auto mechanic, a school teacher. They joke. They discuss politics. They enjoy the dignity that wealth and skill assured. It's a community built on resilience pure, undeniable. Then the noise returns, footsteps in the night, glass shattering, distant screams, and fire. You feel the fear wash over you, the betrayal, the question. How could we forget? But then you feel something else, endurance. Because the story was never fully erased. It was whispered by elders to grandchildren, under porches and in church halls, in songs and sermons. It lived in burnt timbers reused in new houses. It lived in block parties where laughter sounded like defiance. It lived in dreams that whispered, "We will rise again." You think of survivors' men like Gurley, who owned land in Greenwood and dreamed of building a black utopia. Bessie Coleman, whose family survived the riot and later became the first black female pilot. Rebecca Smith, known as the mother of Black Tulsa. They survived, taught their children independence, and passed down history when no one else would. In 2079 years after the violence, the Buffalo Soldiers Motorcycle Club held a ride through Greenwood honoring ancestors, raising public awareness. In 2021, 100 years after the massacre, memorials, public apologies, and a televised special recognized the truth. The story finally demanded to be lifted from the shadows. Now, as you settle closer to sleep, imagine the Greenwood of today, a place carved again from dreams. Locally owned businesses buzz on reclaimed streets. A museum with quiet lights and recording booths where survivors and descendants speak softly into microphones. A greenway traced along charred block numbers. Planting trees where buildings once stood. The Tulsa flag flies high, bricolaged from pain and hope. Your own breath echoes theirs. You sense in yourself the power of remembrance not as anger, but as empathy. Not as anger, but as affirmation. You carry Greenwood now in memory, not as a monument, but as a gentle requiem, as history that hums softly through your veins, as a reminder that even the strongest erasure cannot extinguish the life it tried to bury. And as you drift into sleep, let that image hold you, a city rebuilt in song and stone, a people unbroken, a legacy that outlived the flames. The smoke may have faded, but the story endures. And so do we. Section 8. Chinese Americans and the Railroad. They were erased from. They built the Transcontinental Railroad, yet were left out of the photographs and parades. You find yourself in the shadow of the Sierra Nevada loose gravel underfoot. The crisp mountain air sharp in your lungs. Around you lie unfinished rails, rough-hewn timbers, and a name long suppressed: the Chinese worker. From 1863 to 1869, 15,000 Chinese immigrants labored on the Central Pacific Railroad. They carved tracks through granite, tunneled mountains, laid steel, and braved avalanches. They did the work white laborers refused: dangerous, grueling, relentless. With picks, shovels, and dynamite, they bored through miles of unforgiving rock. They staged the largest strike of the era in 1867, demanding fair wages. They carried supplies and cooked meals at camps in scorching summers and freezing winters. They lost brothers and wives, thousands died. Unmarked, remote. Their families were remote. Their pain invisible, written out of official records, erased from official photographs. This is where our story begins. Invisible yet essential at Promontory Summit, Utah. On May 10, 1869, railroad tycoon Leland Stanford drove the Golden Spike. The photograph afterward is iconic. White engineers, financiers, and dignitaries stand proud before the locomotives. Yet you feel a hollow echo. Where are the Chinese hands that laid hundreds of miles of track? Their backs, bent under century-scale workload. Their names, they walk the edges of the frame nearly invisible. Yet their impact was real. Without them, the bedrock would not be broken. History would not bend. The backbone. Behind the rails. They hailed from Taishan and Wuyi counties, villages of southern China, driven by famine and disruption. When other laborers fled to silver mines, these men stayed and worked. They made up 80–90% of the Central Pacific workforce. Rice bowls and teacups arrived via ship, each bowl heavy with longing, camps rough, tools primitive. Risk was constant: avalanches in spring, heat stroke in summer. Yet they built mountains of possibility. Bridges, tunnels, over 700 miles of track across some of America's hardest geography. Men like Ging Kui, Wang Fuk, Li Shao, names too often unspoken, hammered steel across the Rockies. Erased from the frame. One photograph defines their erasure. The iconic image of the Golden Spike. No Chinese faces stand next to the locomotives. Later research identified two workers in the crowd, tiny figures at the back, but the dominant narrative had already been written without them. It's not an accident, it's a choice. Tales of progress, heroism, nationhood were told with white faces at the fore. Yet, the Chinese railroad workers remained. In camps, cemeteries, letters home. In unmarked graves beneath the rails, they helped lay. In the strike of 1867, a peaceful walkout for equal pay. In laughter around campfires, despite prejudice and red-hot bias, recognition. After a centuries passed, the Golden Spike photo still spoke of white progress, until people like Corky Lee, an Asian American photographer, staged photographic justice in 2014, recreating the photo with Chinese Americans in place. Descendants marched in 1919 anniversary ceremonies. Monuments rose in Utah in 2024. Stanford's Chinese Railroad Workers Project examined archaeology, oral history, and wage records to reconstruct the missing voices. They built America and are finally being named. Memory reclaimed. Look again at the tracings of track disappearing west. Know that every mile owed its line to those brown hands. The sound of hammers and hooves echoes through canyons. The song of those workers drifts across time. Today, descendants gather at Promontory to whisper names of Ging Kui, Wang Fuk, Li Shao. They share songs in Cantonese and English. They place plaques where invisibility once stood. The rails bear weight, but so do these memories. Not just of steel, but of dignity reclaimed. Allow that truth to settle into your bones. They were erased, but they remain. In the earth. In the sky. In the quiet hum of progress born of their sacrifice. Now your breath carries their names. And as you drift, know this. Every time you look down a railroad track, remember the hands that laid it and the silence they broke at last. Section 9. Boarding schools and the erasure of Native children. The U.S. created schools designed to erase Native language, family, and identity. You wake in a dormitory bed you didn't choose. Curtains of coarse fabric block out the sky. A bell clangs. You rise but hesitate. You don't recognize the uniform. Its stiff collar unravels your sense of self. You're not alone. Around you, dozens of children have been brought here far from home, far from ceremony, far from the voices of your grandmother, the scent of cedar smoke, the language you once spoke before noon. Welcome to the boarding school. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, these schools spread from Carlisle, Pennsylvania, across America. Their purpose was clear: kill the Indian, save the man, not with violence, but with erasure. Here, your hair is cut silently, without consent. Your name is replaced with another. Your language disappears. Your grandmother's stories are now myths. Your songs are replaced with hymns. Your prayer becomes prayer in English. Your furs become uniforms. Your identity becomes an experiment in cultural annihilation. You learn not to speak Choctaw, Lakota, Navajo, or whatever your mother tongue was. You're punished for whispering prayer in a foreign tongue. You eat meals of bland bread and watery soup. You make shoes or gardens under guard. You learn math and English and discipline. You're trained for civilization. You're punished for memory. You're buried in a world that doesn't know who you were. The scale of the erasure. More than 400 schools, run by the federal government and churches, held over 60,000 children between 1860 and 1978. Attendance was mandatory. Parents lost choice. Children were taken even by force. They came from at least 140 distinct tribes, across 30-plus states. They lived under guard. They worked in dorms. They learned to hide tears. They practiced silence. The schools claim to educate, but their real curriculum, obedience, erasure, Americanization, and behind it all, a belief rooted in racism that indigenous cultures were uncivilized, that the future of America required one culture only, that the soul of a child could be remade, not healed, but replaced. Bodies and spirits wounded. It was not gentle. Discipline was harsh. Language was forbidden. Children were stripped of clothes, identity, family contact. Many died often from tuberculosis, measles, malnutrition, neglect. Some were buried in unmarked graves far from home. Federal reports suggest at least 500 children died in these schools. Survivors say the number may be closer to 1,000 or more, and the wounds deep, silent, carried across generations. Survivors recall the shock of separation. They remember the shame of having their hair cut, a symbol of maturity and identity reduced to shame. They recall the echoes of screams in solitary punishment. They recall the silence in beds that should not have held them. Many years later, survivors speak of depression, PTSD, addiction enduring trauma born from childhood stolen, families unraveled by forced separation, language lost, ceremony broken. To understand the harm, you must feel it. Imagine your mother pulled out of a cradle. Imagine your name, Ojibwe or Cherokee, replaced with Emma or Percy. Imagine the shame that follows every time someone asks, "What's your name?" It's more than assimilation. It's a soft cultural genocide, but it was federal policy. It was education, resistance and resilience. Hope, however, cannot be boarded up. Some children spoke their languages in secret. They taught siblings in whispers. They carved stories into hidden notebooks. On Sundays, they prayed by memory. At night, they sang lullabies under blankets. They learned farming, but they also learned rebellion. They wrote letters home with invisible ink. They hid fragments of their culture medicine, prayer, food. In secret, they planted seeds literal and spiritual waiting for harvest, a legacy of healing. Only recently has America begun to unbury this story. In 2022, the Department of the Interior released a report identifying more than 65 grave sites at school locations, nearly 1,000 children known to have died, and many still unidentified. Survivors and tribes filed lawsuits in 2025 demanding accountability and reparations. They speak of treaties broken in blood and broken promises. Government apologies began many late and healing initiatives, like Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, have emerged. Yet most schools closed only in the 1960s and 70s. Some continue in spiritual form. Others became day schools. The effects of boarding school trauma ripple today. Intergenerational trauma, suicide rates, addiction. But the branches are being healed. Some communities are reclaiming language. Some are digging up unmarked graves and providing ceremony. Some hold annual survivor gatherings. Some rebuild traditions, potlatches, sun dances, healing ceremonies. The next generation born from wounded memory is learning again, singing in their own tongues, speaking their real names and walking home. Rest in your heart. Take a breath. Let the desks and walls fall away. Close your eyes and imagine a child sitting beneath a pine tree, sewing beaded moccasins. Their grandmother teaching them to say, "I am Cherokee" in soft tones. Or another child learning to translate their grandmother's language, reviving a word that hadn't been spoken for decades. They are reclaiming their names, their songs, their foods, their prayers, each alone, each together, each in ceremony founded on memory and resilience. This is your inheritance now too. The knowledge that silencing was never whole, that despite everything, language survived, that families found ways to speak again. Sleep with this hope. You are resting now, in darkness born of truth. Let it be gentle. Let the memory become your lullaby of a child not erased, but revived. Tucked into dream. They say broken spirits cannot heal. But here, beneath crackling stars, beneath silent forests, beneath the soft earth, they are healing. You lie with them now, among the stones and names, the songs and prayers, the treaty of identity that no school could ever erase completely. Sleep, dear one. The silence has begun to speak. Section 10. Puerto Rico, U.S. Citizens without a voice. Millions of people under the U.S. flag cannot vote for president. You're standing at a crossroads. Before you are waving flags of red, white, and blue, symbols of citizenship and sacrifice. Behind you, the tropical breeze carries the scent of ocean and orange blossoms. You breathe deeply. You belong. You amble toward a ballot box, only to see it's locked. Welcome to Puerto Rico, a place where citizenship doesn't always mean voice. Since 1917, Puerto Ricans have been granted U.S. citizenship. They have born on the island, served in American wars, paid payroll taxes, and answered the call to defend freedom. They've sung the anthem in foreign fields. They've won the Congressional Gold Medal as Borinqueniers. But here, on the island they call home, they cannot vote for president. They cannot elect full members of Congress. Their flags fly high, but their votes fall silent. Citizenship without a voice. Imagine this: you inherit a citizenship status through birth. You are free at least, so you are told. You move freely across the nation's soil. You enlist in the military, pay taxes, and watch your neighbors in Texas or Florida vote. But you cannot cast a vote for president, not unless you leave, not unless you move to a state, not unless you relinquish the home your family has known for generations. The Constitution is clear. Only states and Washington, D.C., since 1961 get electoral college power. Territories like Puerto Rico do not. That's why island residents are excluded from general election ballots, not because they're not American, but because their land isn't part of the Union. Congress did grant them a resident commissioner a voice in the House, but no vote on final bills. And islanders can vote in presidential primaries choosing nominees. Yet, when November arrives, all that choice falls silent. No electors, no vote, soldiers who still don't choose their commander. Puerto Ricans have fought and died for the U.S. flag. The Borinqueniers served in 2 world wars and Korea, earning the nation's highest honor. Yet their families, their neighbors back home, cannot vote for the commander-in-chief they served under. Tens of thousands die in service. They risk everything and return to an island that still cannot influence who oversees the wars, policies, and promises they defended. Colonial silence cloaked in courts. The Jones-Shafroth Act of 1917 gave Puerto Ricans citizenship but not full political rights. The insular cases upheld this status, labeling the territory foreign in a domestic sense, citizens without political power. Petitions to allow presidential voting from the island have risen and fallen in the courts since the 1950s. Courts repeatedly ruled citizenship alone doesn't guarantee electoral rights. Statehood would. An amendment would. Until then, silence reigns. A people divided by status, born into limbo. Residents face an identity crisis too American to be ignored, too unrepresented to be equal. Referendums in 2020 and 2024 saw majority vote for statehood, but Congress ignored them. To stay in the Union with full representation, to keep U.S. citizenship with full rights, to have a voice in their future. Yet each referendum is non-binding. Territory status limits Congress. Political inertia delays change and silence persists. Everyday America. Silent in the vote. You walk through San Juan or Ponce. You see campaign signs for governor, mayor, legislature, dozens of ballots for local power. But missing the blue box for the presidency. You fill your ballot. You mail it. You watch election night like everyone else. You cheer. You cry. But your vote doesn't count. You can write to your resident commissioner in Washington. You can lobby committees. But you can't break the final seal. You don't choose who makes the laws. Someone else does. Struggle and resilience. Still, hope breathes quietly in the island's soul. Activists organize marches titled Raza, Estado, Ya Race, State Now. They lobby for the Puerto Rico Status Act bills introduced in Congress since 2020 to stage a binding referendum and implement its result. They gather stories of citizens who fought and voted, only to return to Americana without a vote. They launch advocacy campaigns like Puerto Rico 51st. They argue that the 4 million U.S. citizens here larger than Iowa, Arkansas, or Nevada deserve full democratic inclusion. What if you could vote here? Imagine casting your ballot under the Caribbean sun, choosing candidate for president, debating national issues while sipping coffee from local cafes, voting alongside your neighbors without a bus ride to a mainland state, voting for issues that matter: day-to-day education, healthcare, environmental aid, debt relief, while also selecting a national leader. Imagine that moment not just an echo in a primary, but real, final, and counted. Now, what will you do with the silence? You're lying here in the hush of this moment. You are not angry. You are calm. You are reflective, but you carry awareness. Citizenship is more than papers. It is storytelling and standing in the voting booth. It is continuity and collective power. And here, in Puerto Rico, American identity lives but cannot fully act in American democracy. Let that knowledge rest gently in you tonight. Remember those who give voice with their service but whose island has no echo in the halls of power. Some nights, silence is a wound. Other nights, it is a question: what can be healed tomorrow? 11. Why MLK was unpopular before he was a monument. The man they now honor was once the man they feared. You've heard the dream. The echo of "I have a dream" has floated through school hallways, commercials, public holidays. But that soft, inspirational version of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is not the man many Americans knew while he was alive. In the final years before his assassination, King's approval rating was below 30%. To many white Americans and even some within the Black community, King had become too radical, too disruptive, too critical of the status quo. The government labeled him a threat. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, called him the most dangerous man in America. He was wiretapped, surveilled, and slandered. In private memos, officials plotted ways to destroy his credibility, even urging him to take his own life. But what made him so dangerous? It wasn't just his calls for racial equality. By the mid-1960s, King had turned his attention to deeper, more systemic critiques of poverty, militarism, capitalism, and American empire. He spoke out against the Vietnam War, calling it an enemy of the poor, and accused the U.S. of being the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. These statements didn't sit comfortably with liberal allies or political elites. Newspapers called him unpatriotic. Fellow civil rights leaders feared he was fracturing the movement. His 1967 speech Beyond Vietnam, delivered at Riverside Church in New York, was a turning point. King did what few leaders dared. He linked racial injustice at home to military violence abroad. He painted a picture of a country that preached freedom while bombing children in Southeast Asia. It was a vision not of civil harmony, but of deep moral contradiction. Overnight, he was no longer just a civil rights hero. He was a political agitator. And yet, even as public support waned, King doubled down. He launched the Poor People's Campaign, a multiracial movement demanding economic justice and a radical restructuring of American priorities. He planned marches not just in the South, but in the heart of Washington. He stood with striking sanitation workers in Memphis, demanding not just dignity, but a living wage. These actions are rarely taught in classrooms. The version of King most children learn is sanitized a man of peace, harmony, and polite resistance. The real King was far more complex, deeply moral. Yes, but also relentlessly confrontational. He made people uncomfortable. He challenged not just individual attitudes, but entire systems, and he paid the price. On April 4th, 1968, he was shot on a motel balcony in Memphis. In the years that followed, monuments were built, a holiday was passed, speeches were replayed, but the radical edge, the parts that questioned militarism, capitalism, and systemic inequality, were softened, even erased. Today, many honor Dr. King with quotes and murals, but fewer remember that in his lifetime, he was labeled a threat to American values. The dream was never just about peace. It was about power, justice, and deep moral reckoning. And that version of King is still uncomfortable to face. 12. COINTELPRO. The FBI's war on American voices. A silent war was waged on the loudest cries for justice. You were told that freedom of speech is sacred, that democracy listens, that dissent is patriotic. But deep in the shadows of American history lies a program that dismantled those ideals not through open debate, but through surveillance, sabotage, and psychological warfare. From the 1950s through the 1970s, the FBI ran COINTELPRO, short for Counterintelligence Program, a covert operation that secretly targeted American citizens deemed subversive, their crime, organizing, questioning, protesting, dreaming of change. Civil rights leaders, Black power activists, Native organizers, feminists, anti-war protesters, even musicians and professors all became subjects of files, phone taps, and false narratives. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was one of the most heavily monitored figures. The FBI sent him anonymous letters urging him to end his life. Malcolm X was watched obsessively. The Black Panther Party was labeled a domestic threat, infiltrated, and dismantled from within. But COINTELPRO wasn't just watching. It was acting. Agents spread disinformation to fracture movements from the inside. They forged letters, turned allies against one another, and leaked false stories to the press. They got people fired, got people arrested, got people killed. What made this program so effective and so insidious was its invisibility. The average American had no idea it existed. Activists didn't know if their closest companions were informants. Fear and paranoia became weapons. Trust itself began to corrode. It wasn't until internal FBI documents were stolen and leaked in 1971 that COINTELPRO was exposed to the public. Even then, many details remained buried. No high-level officials were held accountable. The program was quietly shut down, but surveillance continued in new forms, under new names. Today, echoes remain. Whistleblowers are still punished. Protesters are still monitored. Entire communities remain skeptical of institutions that once declared them enemies of the state. The legacy of COINTELPRO isn't just about the past. It's about how power reacts when people speak too loudly, too clearly, or too freely. It's a reminder that history doesn't only record what happens, it also erases what power prefers we forget. 13. The fight for clean water. That took a generation. When water became poison, it was ordinary people who refused to stay quiet. You might believe that in a modern, wealthy nation, clean water is given a basic promise, silently honored every time a faucet turns. But there are places in the United States where water became a threat, and where families spent decades pleading, protesting, and grieving just to drink without fear. In the late 1970s, the quiet neighborhood of Love Canal in Niagara Falls, New York, began to change. Children fell ill. Mysterious odors drifted from the ground. Basements filled with a strange, toxic sludge. Residents didn't know they were living on 21,000 tons of buried chemical waste, dumped by a company decades earlier, and then covered up with homes and schools. When the truth came out, it wasn't the government that sounded the alarm. It was the mothers. Housewives and teachers transformed into full-time activists, demanding relocation, health studies, and federal response. Their voices forced President Carter to declare a state of emergency, one of the first environmental justice victories in U.S. history. But history repeated. In Flint, Michigan, beginning in 2014, another community faced poisoned water. This time not from buried waste, but from political negligence. Officials switched the city's water source to the Flint River without proper treatment, and lead leached into the pipes. Children were poisoned. Trust was shattered. And once again, it was ordinary citizens, especially Black mothers, who raised their voices when no one else would listen. They collected samples, documented illnesses, and refused to be dismissed. It took years for authorities to admit fault. The pipes still aren't fully replaced. Clean water, it turns out, is not a promise, it's a fight. And it's often fought by the people with the least political power, the fewest resources, and the most to lose. The legacy of Love Canal and Flint reminds us that environmental harm is rarely accidental. It's systemic. And the burden falls hardest on communities of color, low-income neighborhoods, and places deemed politically expendable. Across the country, similar battles continue in Jackson, Mississippi, in the Navajo Nation, in rural coal towns and urban housing projects. Lead, PFAS, arsenic, and more still contaminate supplies. Boil water advisories are routine for some Americans, but so is resistance. Communities once silenced have learned the language of policy, science, and law. They organize. They testify. They refuse to drink in silence. Because clean water isn't just about health, it's about dignity, memory, the right to raise a child without fear of what pours from the tap. 14. Mutual aid. How neighbors quietly save each other. When governments failed, people created their own systems of care and survival. You live in a neighborhood where the streetlights haven't worked for months. The nearest hospital closed years ago. Groceries cost too much. The buses don't come on time. And no one from City Hall has ever returned your calls. But down the block, someone has started putting crates of food on their porch. A hand-painted sign reads, "Take what you need. Leave what you can." That's mutual aid. Not charity, not government relief, but people standing in the gap. Quiet, local, immediate. Long before the phrase went viral during the pandemic, mutual aid was already the lifeline for generations. In enslaved communities of the American South, secret networks of mothers, midwives, and medicine keepers passed care hand to hand. In immigrant tenements, neighbors shared rent, heat, and translation. During strikes, during storms, and through centuries of silence, mutual aid kept people alive when no one else did. It is a term both ancient and urgent, coined in modern form by the 19th century anarchist Peter Kropotkin. Mutual aid described something he had seen in nature and in struggling communities alike: survival, not through domination, but cooperation. The strongest species, he argued, were not the ones that devoured the weak, but the ones who helped each other, especially in crisis. Kropotkin was writing against the idea that humans are naturally selfish. He wasn't alone. In the early 20th century, Black communities across the U.S. formed sick and burial societies, pooling small weekly dues to ensure no neighbor would die alone or be buried without dignity. These informal insurance pools, often led by women, were a form of economic resistance, community health, and social dignity all at once. And they were mutual aid in its clearest form. People doing for each other what no one else would do for them. When mainstream history talks about activism, it often focuses on protests, speeches, and laws. But mutual aid was always the quiet engine beneath those movements. The care work, the meals, the transportation, the housing. When the Montgomery bus boycott began in 1955, Black women organized massive carpool systems so workers could get to their jobs. There was no app, no funding, no permission, just coordination community, and an understanding. We take care of us. Perhaps no American group embodied mutual aid more boldly than the Black Panther Party, often remembered for their politics and confrontation. The Panthers also ran more than 60 survival programs, free breakfast for children, health clinics, sickle cell anemia screenings, school clothing drives. These were not charity. They were structured acts of political care, built on the belief that survival itself is resistance. When governments neglected the needs of Black communities, the Panthers created infrastructure to meet them, and they did it every day. Mutual aid is not about generosity. It is about justice. And unlike charity, which often reinforces hierarchies between giver and receiver, mutual aid insists on something radical: that all of us need help sometimes, and all of us have something to give. In the 1980s, during the height of the AIDS crisis, mutual aid again surfaced with power, as government leaders ignored or openly mocked the rising death toll. Activists in groups like ACT UP and the Gay Men's Health Crisis built their own systems: meal deliveries, medical networks, legal advocacy, buddy systems, even underground pharmacies. They fought for access, and they took care of each other while doing it. Many who lived through those years say they survived because of mutual aid. And then came the pandemic. In the early months of COVID-19, as systems faltered, millions of people found themselves without work, food, healthcare, or support. In response, mutual aid groups sprang up across the country, sometimes overnight. A spreadsheet in a city turned into a phone tree. A neighborhood group chat became a delivery route. Strangers organized grocery drop-offs, diaper donations, mental health check-ins, and eviction defense squads. These weren't random acts of kindness. They were systems fragile, improvised, and deeply human. In cities like New Orleans, mutual aid groups distributed masks long before governments did. In Chicago, undocumented communities pooled funds for those ineligible for federal aid. In Oakland, Black and Indigenous groups offered healing circles, childcare, and COVID-safe funerals. Many of these networks were led by women, queer people, and those who had long existed outside mainstream institutions. Some of these mutual aid networks faded when lockdowns lifted. Others stayed. In Jackson, Mississippi, when the water system collapsed in 2022, residents went weeks without running water. Local and federal responses were slow, underfunded, and patchy. But mutual aid networks mobilized within hours. They organized water drives, coordinated deliveries, and launched massive fundraising campaigns to buy bottled water in bulk. In an echo of past disasters, it was ordinary people, not institutions, who responded first, fastest, and most creatively. What makes mutual aid so powerful is also what makes it invisible. It is not run by nonprofits with newsletters and branding. It does not apply for government grants. It often exists in undocumented space church basements, kitchen tables, WhatsApp threads. It is unofficial, which makes it harder to track, harder to regulate, and harder to co-opt. But it works. And it has always worked, not because people are naturally good, but because people understand something deeply. Survival is collective. There's a reason governments and elites have long feared mutual aid. In the early 1900s, mutual aid societies among immigrant laborers were routinely surveilled or shut down. Black fraternal organizations were taxed out of existence. The Black Panther Party was labeled a national threat not just because of their politics, but because their breakfast programs were wildly effective. Feeding children, apparently, was revolutionary. Today, many mutual aid groups operate with caution, knowing their work may be praised in theory but threatened in practice. Even so, the need and the love persists. You see it in rural towns after a flood, where neighbors rebuild each other's homes before FEMA arrives. You see it in prison visitation rooms, where families coordinate rides for strangers. You see it in refugee camps, in food deserts, in housing encampments, wherever people find themselves on the edge. They often find each other. There are critiques, too. Some worry that mutual aid lets governments off the hook, that it fills the gaps too well, allowing officials to neglect their duties. Others point out that without systemic change, mutual aid can only go so far. It's true. A food box won't fix poverty. A ride to court won't stop deportation. But mutual aid is not the end goal. It is the bridge, the thread, the fire kept alive while others sleep. At its best, mutual aid does more than meet needs. It builds belonging. When you pick up a bag of groceries from your neighbor's porch, you're not just fed, you're seen. You're not a number on a form. You're part of something. That sense of connection, that you matter, that you're remembered, that you're needed, may be the most radical offering of all. Because in the end, mutual aid isn't just about survival. It's about imagining a world where no one is left to survive alone. Section 15. How memory lives in art. Food and song history can be erased from books, but it lives in rhythm, flavor, and story. You close your eyes and drift into an old kitchen. Sunlight sneaking through lace curtains. A grandmother stirs a pot of stew, her hands moving with ritual familiarity. You inhale spices, smoky, sweet, herbal, a scent that carries across time, across continents. In her voice comes a story, not learned in school, but remembered in her bones. How potatoes once nourished ancestors during famine. How a pinch of chili recalled journeys across oceans. That meal, simple and warm, is memory. A bridge to the past, built with scent and taste. Art as memory's mirror. Walk into a small museum where the walls hum with color and memory. There is a painting, a rural southern scene, cotton fields and children skipping through grass. Pause. Notice the lines, the palette, the sky turning purple with dusk. It's not about accuracy. It's about inheritance. It's a memory painting, like the work of Helen LaFrance and Horace Pippin, self-taught artists who painted scenes from daily life that textbooks forgot. A Sunday service, a backyard quilt circle, a harvest at dusk. Their art keeps alive what history tried to forget. In contemporary native art, you might see cedar and pigment painted as abstract maps, signifying sacred places erased from maps but remembered in art. Each dot, swirl, carved line carries ceremony, genealogy, memory. Art doesn't just reproduce sight, it reproduces culture. Art is time distilled. A painter in rural Kentucky captures a church revival that ended decades ago. A sculptor in urban Harlem repurposes discarded metal into a figure walking north the Great Migration. Each piece says, "We were here." Food flavors that remember, from soul foods, collard greens and cornbread, to indigenous corn soups and Haitian griot. Food carries memory in its rhythms: wash, Chop, stir, season, taste. It's storytelling you swallow. In West African diaspora kitchens, recipes survived the Middle Passage. Yams boiled with pepper, okra stews, peanut-based sauces, remnants of ancestors transformed under new skies. That food wasn't just nourishment. It was survival, resistance, an act of remembrance. The act of cooking it is an acknowledgement we are here. We remember. Consider soul food in America. It's not just comfort fare. It's identity. It's liberation. It is rebellion on a plate, turning scraps into feasts, turning oppression into banquet. It's recipes: fried chicken, black-eyed peas, sweet potato pie speak of memory, cunning, adaptation. They are core narratives of resilience. In Native communities, reviving wild rice, gathering ramps, cooking fry bread are acts of cultural reclamation. Each recipe carries a medicine story, a migration story, a landscape story. You taste the river. You taste the forest. You taste the ancestors. Song memory with breath music is sound made flesh, but also spirit. It's memory you can hum. In African American spirituals, you find coded messages, prayer, grief. In one verse, whispers of the Nile and Exodus, of bondage and deliverance. These were songs that carried hope through slavery. They lined the Underground Railroad. They carried hymns to church on Sunday. But Sunday wasn't only worship, it was map, archive, prophecy and song. When the industrial blues emerge, Bessie Smith, Robert Johnson, you hear the weight of exile, the sadness of broken promises, the sly joy of survival. Jazz scatters memories in improvisation, remaking songs in new keys, new rhythms. It's memory renewed, reinvented. Native lullabies remind children of the stars, of ancestors, of protective spirits. Their notes float like cedar smoke across generations. And in migrant communities, Puerto Rican plena in New York, Punjabi Bhangra in British ghettos, you hear memory as adaptation, foreign landscapes echoing home rhythms. When we dance or hum these songs, we carry that memory forward, even if we can't remember the first time someone sang it. Collective memory in culture. Memory isn't private, it's communal. Art collectives, food festivals, music gatherings. They are memory gatherings. An exhibit of Sankofa art, referencing the Ghanaian symbol of go back and get it, weaves past and future. The symbol appears stitched on shirts in DC, carved into memorials, inked on wrists, a reminder that ignoring history leaves you incomplete. Artists invoking Sankofa ask us, what will you reclaim? Exhibits like Ancestral Connections bring indigenous voices forward, not as relics, but as living memory. Artists use pigment and timber to remember land stories, colonization, treaties, reconnection. Street murals in cities reclaim public memory. A mural of a lion-headed Black Panther, rifle in hand, looms unfinished on a boarded-up wall, marking both struggle and hope. When people pass, they don't just see color, they see history, memory that nourishes us all. You taste the stew, hum the hymn, see the painting, and you feel rooted. Your body channels memory even when your mind doesn't recognize it. It speaks of belonging, memory through art, food. Song is the ultimate resistance to erasure. It does not write curriculum, yet it fills the gaps textbooks leave behind. It speaks to hearts. It feeds on soul. When you wake at 2 a.m. from a dream you can't place, Maybe you smell cinnamon from your grandmother's kitchen, or you hum a tune you learned from your mother. Those are not your own memories. Only they are the echoes of generations. Tonight, carry memories softly in you. Let the taste of spice and the shade of pigment guide you. Let the hum of a spiritual or an ancestral song cradle you into darkness. Because even when stories are taken, stolen, or buried, their ghosts linger in flavor, in rhythm, in color. They breathe in you. Sleep deeply. Let memory guide you home. Let history rest in your heart. Section 16. What the Constitution didn't say. Silence on slavery. The Constitution never said the word slavery, but protected it in silence. You open a worn, leather-bound book, the Constitution, with reverence, as if touching history itself. You read Article 1, Section 2. You read Article Y, Section 9. You read Article 5, and the Fugitive Slave Clause. There, carefully encoded, words appear that never say what you expect. They never say slavery. That word is nowhere to be found. Instead, it lurks in omissions, silent protections, and hidden bargains. The Constitution whispers around bondage, never naming it. But the effect is deafening, concealed in the text. The founders faced a powerful dilemma. Some states banned slavery. Others thrived because of it. Nobody wanted to ignite a civil war before the ink dried. So they crafted a document that danced around the issue. Article Y. Section 2 counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for taxation and representation. Article Y. Section 9 said Congress couldn't ban the importation of such persons, a veiled reference to enslaved people for 20 years. Article 5 protected the importation rule so no amendment could target it before 1808. Article 4 required escaped persons held to service to be returned to their masters. Even in states where abolition was law, nowhere was the word slave used. Instead, the document called them other persons, such persons, or persons held to service. Slavery was assumed and protected without ever appearing by name, a legal acknowledgement of injustice. Imagine reading laws that shape your life without ever naming your existence. That's what the Constitution did. It enshrined a human system of forced labor, while pretending to be about freedom. It protected slaveholders in Georgia and South Carolina. It prevented northern states from legislating against human trafficking. It allowed the continued displacement of people, legally, socially, nationally, but not morally visible. If you believed America stood for universal liberty, this silence would be shocking, because freedom was being rewritten on paper, but not practiced in the fields. It was professed in front of God and Congress, but practiced at the whip's pace. The Great Compromise. Consider the framing between states. The founders ensured Georgia's enslaved labor wouldn't overpower Rhode Island's freemen. They built political blocks around a stolen foundation. The Great Compromise and the apportionment clauses made sure a minority, with a majority of property and people in bondage, could shape federal policy. They could tax. They could declare war. They could legislate without ever naming why they were counted. Silent protections. Ravaging impacts. Slavery was protected not just politically, but institutionally. The 3/5 Compromise enhanced Southern voting strength. The Fugitive Slave Clause made free states complicit in slavery enforcement. Northern states and Supreme Courts upheld such rights. They used state and federal laws to track, arrest, and ship Black people back into bondage. When John Brown raided Harper's Ferry in 1859, he targeted a tool of constitutional silence. He tried to ignite a rebellion against the structure that allowed slavery to breathe in hidden corners. When the Dred Scott decision came in 1857 declaring black people non-citizens and banning Congress from regulating slavery in territories, it reinforced the Constitution's protective silence. It said not that slavery must continue, but that freedom, for some people, must not begin. Silence wedded to power. In practice, this meant America's birth people sold. People working under work rules of bondage. People without rights yet legislatively protected as economic units. This silence reverberated in state capitals and courtrooms. It shaped legal education, economic interests, migrations, rebellions. It influenced the path from Missouri Compromise to Civil War because those clauses protected slavery nationally, while pretending to avert it locally, a link to America's center. While your school might teach that the Civil War fixed everything, many modern legal historians argue it didn't start with slavery. It started over silence. The war, for many, was a war over words. Whether slavery could hide behind documents while being applied in full force. The Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation toppled tangible slavery. The 13th Amendment finally wrote slavery into abolition. But decades passed before the phrase equal protection under the law was widely enforced. A quiet reckoning. Now, millions of images in museums show shackles, auctions, whips, the emancipation in paintings, Frederick Douglass standing tall, the civil rights movement. But the Constitution's original words are like a seed of silence that took centuries to uproot. Your breath grows softer as you consider it. A document of freedom used silence to protect bondage. A law of the land that never named injustice. A text around which so much suffering turned. And yet, that silence did not last forever. It was revealed. It was written over with amendments, with rights, with equal protection. The rest you carry. Let that truth rest gently in you, a reminder that silence can shield, even as it hides. That words withheld have power. That naming injustice is the first step to ending it. Tonight, drift deeper into rest. Let the hidden knowledge soothe your mind, and sleep with the understanding that names matter. Silence matters. Words matter, because the story of this country whispers its truths even in the spaces between lines. 17. The American Eugenics movement before Hitler came to power. The U.S. sterilized thousands under racial science long before Nazi Germany. You're asleep in a silent house when the memory drifts in children being led down a sterile corridor. Women in gowns. Strangers in white coats gently whispering, "It's for your own good." Only they didn't mean your good. They meant the nation's. This was America in the early 20th century, when forces of science and prejudice blended into policy, and the victims were often the weakest among us. The concept of eugenics wasn't fringe. It was mainstream. In 1907, Indiana passed the nation's first compulsory sterilization law aimed at the unfit, those labeled criminals, the mentally ill, epileptics. This was followed by 32 other states, all agreeing that some lives were better left unpraised. It was seen as public health, progress, a service to future generations. It wasn't barbaric in theory. It was enlightened. Between 1907 and the 1960s, More than 64,000 Americans were sterilized, many without their consent or understanding. The worst offenders weren't backwater institutions, but cultural centers of power and prestige. In California alone, some 20,000 forced sterilizations took place, often targeting people of color, the poor, and people labeled feeble-minded. In Virginia, courts operated under the mantra, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough, culminating in the landmark Buck v. Bell, 1927, Supreme Court decision that solidified legal protections for forced sterilization. Virginia's law sterilized over 7,000 by 1979. Even though courts later apologized and offered reparations, silent hospitals and dusty files hid these truths for decades until voices began to speak. But the policies weren't only local, they were global. American eugenicists believed they were creating a better world. Newspapers, universities, and scientific journals praised their work. In 1929, a book celebrating California sterilizations was released, soon becoming required reading for Nazi officials. Hitler himself praised America as a better conception of citizenship, borrowing ideas for the law for the prevention of genetically diseased offspring, passed in 1933. Americans did not stop sterilizing when Nazis came to power. Some even marketed the process as proof of its effectiveness. These ideas crossed the Atlantic. Hitler copied them, and dark Europe followed. The reality on the ground was worse. Women, especially Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and disabled women, were targeted disproportionately. In the 1920s and 30s, institutions decided who was fit to reproduce. Poor men and women had no say. Later, sterilizations focused on unwaged mothers and teenagers in public housing, Puerto Rican women, and Native American women in federal health services without their informed consent. Almost 1/3 of childbearing-age Puerto Rican women underwent sterilization legally, a form of population control masked as healthcare. In prisons, doctors like Leo Stanley at San Quentin sterilized convicted men under the guise of reform. From 1997 to 2013, more than 400 incarcerated women in California were sterilized, many without proper approval. Churches, businessmen, government officials, many endorsed eugenics. Colleges hosted fitter family contests. Hospitals quietly performed procedures as part of social programming. The message was clear. Some people didn't deserve families. You might think these horrors ended long ago, but echoes remain. Buck v. Bell was never overturned. Its precedent remains in place. Forced sterilization laws existed in some states into the 1970s, and medical reports suggest coerced sterilizations continued in prisons and detention centers into the 21st century. In recent decades, states like North Carolina and Virginia have offered reparations, but survivors still await. In 2021, California launched a small compensation fund for sterilization survivors. Only 600 out of hundreds claimed. Survivors often lack documentation because medical records were lost or destroyed. The wounds are fresh, but deep in this shameful chapter, you find courage. Survivors and descendants are gathering, sharing stories, filing lawsuits. They demand justice, not just money, but acknowledgement, truth, apology. They demand that history name these acts for what they were: race and disability-based genocide carried out by American institutions. They hold ceremonies to reclaim their bodies and their memories. They teach a new generation about reproductive autonomy, bodily rights, and medical trust. They cut ribbons for memorials to lost lives. They photograph bills, court cases, hospital logs, turning paper into proof. Tonight, lean into that courage. Take a breath and imagine a sterilized woman, young and scared, leaving a hospital empty just as she entered. Imagine the pain of a mother who lost her reproductive future because someone said she was unfit. Imagine being told your family's legacy was a genetic burden. Now imagine them speaking back. Imagine their names, their resilience, their refusal to disappear. We sleep in houses built with their dreams. We walk streets financed by a policy meant to limit them. Their bodies shape the contours of American society even as institutions tried to erase their bloodlines. In that quiet space, memory and justice meet. Because knowing takes us somewhere. It insists we name wrongs and stay awake. It says never again. Not because we forgot, but because we remember. Tonight, rest with that truth: eugenics was American. And America still lives with it. Sleep softly, holding that knowledge like a promise. And let justice breathe. Section 18. Vietnam Veterans Against the War. The soldiers who protested. Some soldiers returned home and stood against the war they fought. You were drafted or volunteered, sent into dense jungles where helicopters roared overhead and the scent of napalm lay in the air. You watched friends fall. You felt your hands tremble. And you learned the bitter taste of survival by chance, not choice. Then you returned home to a noise you couldn't tune out: protest signs, tear gas, baby killer shouts, and the unfazed hum of televised news. The war didn't end when you left Vietnam. It followed you home. It was in that dissonance between battlefield sacrifice and national indifference that a group formed: Vietnam Veterans Against the War. VVO. They were soldiers who traded rifles for protest signs, their medals for shame. They changed not just how the war was seen, but how soldiers were understood. Born in dissent. On April 15, 1967, during a massive protest in New York City, a small cluster of men who had worn U.S. uniforms raised a banner: Vietnam Veterans Against the War. They weren't strangers to death, but to a cause. Some were West Point trained, others chaplain's assistants, some black, some white, some broken. They agreed on one thing: they'd fought the war together, now they had to fight for the truth together. By June 1967, 6 of them met in an apartment, and the organization began. One of them was Jan Barry, a former radio specialist whose voice became the group's poetic nerve. Another was Carl Rogers, a chaplain's assistant who denounced the war before he even came home. There was Ron Kovich, wounded and determined, who would later be immortalized in Born on the 4th of July. They embraced a simple principle: veterans knew what war was, and that knowledge mattered. Breaking the myth before Viva. Dissent was an act of civilians. Flag-wearing men trained to kill rarely spoke. When these veterans showed up at protests, wearing medals still pinned to their uniforms, they shattered the comfortable narrative. They were not traitors. They were men who had served and survived. In April 1971, nearly 800 of them marched to the Capitol. There, in silent ritual, they stripped off their medals and ribbon symbols once worn in honor and threw them at the fence. Each clang was a question: was this honor worth it? The image of medals scattered on marble steps ran worldwide. It was shock. It was grief. It was resistance. A nation's mirror surprise is an understatement. Mainstream veterans disliked them. Many saw protest as betrayal. Newspapers called them crybabies. But history remembers them as brave. Historians note that efforts to divide veterans from protesters never quite took hold, thanks to VVAW and the powerful vividness of their voices. Their protest wasn't theoretical. It was personal. They had seen the cost and paid it, and they refused to allow others to forget. From protest to power. But they did more than protest. They organized. They testified. They revealed war crimes like My Lai in congressional hearings. They raised awareness of Agent Orange. They walked in hunger strikes until the Veterans Administration agreed to investigate shitty hospital conditions and provide help for mental trauma. They demanded transparency about war crimes, better VA services, rights and rehabilitation for veterans with PTSD, complete withdrawal from Vietnam. They wore uniforms, not as armor, but as truth. Their message was simple. We are not against America. We are against the war. The cost of courage. They paid a price. Ron Kovich was arrested 12 times. He was beaten and jailed. Jan Berry faced FBI surveillance. Many veterans were stigmatized, untreated, and silenced on campus. Harvard and Yale refused to read their literary testimonies. Their war memories became political propaganda, yet they persisted. Their courage redefined patriotism, their legacy lives. VVAW never disappeared. Membership fluctuated tens of thousands at its peak in 1971. After the war ended, some drifted. Others turned to broader causes, from anti-nuclear protests to civil rights, anti-imperialism, and health advocacy. John Barry became a poet and journalist. Ron Kovich expanded his activism globally, speaking out against Iraq and Afghanistan. They viewed their protest as an extension of service, a second duty to their brothers who'd served and died, and to the nation they loved enough to challenge. Their structure veterans banded for reform lives on today in Veterans for Peace, Iraq, Veterans Against the War, and other groups. Their model remains simple and powerful. When power fails, people act. Sleep with their witness tonight. As the world falls away, breathe life into their courage. Imagine a soldier, not a hero in a parade, but a skeptic with medals thrown away. His hands are trembling not from fear, but from sorrow. His uniform is dusted and worn. He looks at the Capitol steps and realizes the system he believed in sent him to lie on hilltops with a rifle in his hands. And now he's asking for the truth. Imagine Jan Barry's quiet fury when those medals meant nothing. Imagine Ron Kovich in his wheelchair, speaking in front of strangers about grief deeper than any battlefield wound. These aren't comic book heroes. They're real, flawed, frightened. Still, they chose to bear testimony. The quiet awakening. In the lull between thoughts, let this settle true. Patriotism is not always applause. Sometimes it's bearing ugly truths. Sometimes it's protest in uniform. Sometimes it's walking back through a checkpoint, not into war, but into protest. Rest in that truth now. Their voices echo in memorials and laws, in families, in veterans asked thank you for your service, in young soldiers with medals weighing on their chests. Their protest lives not in headlines, but in conscience. Sleep, knowing that when war silenced reason, veterans found ways to speak truth anyway, and that truth still hums beneath the quiet of the night. Section 19. Operation Wetback. When the U.S. deported its own workers. In 1954, the U.S. mass deported laborers it had once invited. You're driving through California's fields under a scorching summer sun. Rows of lettuce stretch ahead, and the air smells of dust and ripening vegetables. You're thirsty. You belong here. Your hands have bled for this labor. You came under a government contract, part of a joint U.S. Mexico agreement called the Bracero Program. You worked legally, planted seeds, harvested crops. But today, it's different. Today, they're calling it illegal. You navigate a roadblock. Men with badges and guns wave you down. They shout orders in English. They start loading men into trucks, your friends, your co-workers, your neighbors. They shout a word that stings Wetback. Because you and many others crossed the border once and now your bodies mark both welcome and betrayal. This was Operation Wetback, launched by Eisenhower's administration in June 1954. It was a militarized deportation campaign meant to show the nation that undocumented migration would not be tolerated even as the government had invited workers for years, from invitation to rejection. During World War II, the U.S. faced a labor crisis in agriculture. The Bracero Program was created a legal, government-backed solution. Millions of Mexican workers crossed the border seasonally, often living in company camps, earning wages, and sending remittances home. They filled fields with dignity and their labor fed a nation. But after the war, economic conditions shifted. Farmers used the program to pay low wages. Some laborers overstayed their contracts. Fear and racism grew. In 1953, a government commissioner painted migration as an invasion. Media described undocumented laborers as criminals taking American jobs. Instead of reforming the worker program, the government launched a crackdown. A rapid roundup. In June 1954, Border Patrol agents and local police hit California, Arizona, Texas, and beyond. It was a sea of uniforms, checkpoints, raids. In Los Angeles, operations were staged in factories and neighborhoods. In Texas, Border Patrol drove down roads at night calling out in Spanish, "Váyanse, váyanse." People ran. Children cried. Families were separated. The INS claimed they deported 1.3 million people that year. Historians estimate the real number closer to 300,000. Some were undocumented. Many were legal braceros. Some held citizenship. Many were sent far inland to Mexico City or Guadalajara, stranded hours from home. They were dumped with no food, no money, no connection. Some fled again. They returned home to sweat in the same fields. The program destabilized families, uprooted communities, and spread trauma across generations. Human walls, hidden stories. Inside detention centers, conditions were brutal hot. Cramped trucks, no water, packed like cattle. In Texas, one boat deported thousands over the Gulf. Some died of sunstroke or disease. No records were kept. Across the U.S., workers disappeared. Children got lost. Labor shortages surged again. But the uprooted remained nightmares many would not admit. Mexican-American civil rights groups like LULAC reluctantly supported the operation, hoping to distance assimilated Mexican Americans from undocumented workers. Yet, Operation Wetback disrupted nearly everyone in its path. Workers who paid taxes and families who voted regardless of citizenship. In Chicago, airplanes flew undocumented families to Mexico City. ignoring their legal status. A mother watched her children cry as the plane soared away. Backlash and repetition operation. Wetback inflamed U.S. Mexico relations. Mexican government protested. Labor became scarce again. Undocumented migration under the radar resumed. The campaign didn't stop flows. It only bred fear and distrust. Yet, it became a model. Eisenhower's deportation methods have since been invoked by modern administrations. It made mass deportation seem possible if ugly, brutal, and ineffective in the long run. The legacy of erasure. This history is rarely taught. We speak of immigration reform, guest workers, unions, but not of men deported from farms they never left, of families lost to bureaucracy, of fear drenching neighborhoods long after the fear campaign ended. Yet, the legacy persists in migrant silence, in waves of exile passed down, in children who feel their parents whisper under stars que no regreses donde ellos puedan encontrarte. Don't go back where they can find you. Resilience from roots. Despite brutality, that labor built America. It fed the war on Hitler. It kept food affordable during Depression and recovery. Later, braceros organized for rights. Magonistas, activists, farm workers like Cesar Chavez learned early from deportations about vulnerability and dignity. Chump apricot pickers became organizers. They carved out unions, protested working conditions, and pressed for farm worker justice. They channeled anger into advocacy and built movements that shaped laws. Your breath carries their steps. Tonight, drift into sleep with this quietly held truth. You belong not in fear. Your labor is not shame. Your voices are not silent unless we make them so. They erased names from ballots and paperwork, but they could not erase memory. In the still of night, hear the whisper of footsteps, men walking back to fields, back to survival. Women loading food into porches before disappearing across fences. Children learning in secret to speak English and Spanish, both their languages. Both their belonging. They carried home tiny stitches of justice, organizing for fair wages, demanding recognition, resisting erasure. Sleep with their hope. Let this settle softly in your chest. Walls can be built. Deportations can shake communities. Fear can be deployed. But memory lives in seed packets, home-cooked meals, clandestine stories. You are here tonight, breathing among the descendants of those deported and those who stayed. Let that be enough. Let that be a promise. Sleep in this quiet knowing. The stories continue not only on pages, but in your steady pulse of presence. Section 20. The history that still breathes in you. You may not remember, but the story remembers you. You lie here in the quiet dark, where even your breath feels alive. You assume history is something distant, old wars, extinct tribes, ancestors whose names are lost in fading wills. But tonight, you will meet a different history, one that breathes, not in dusty pages, but in your heartbeat. History doesn't only exist in museums and textbooks. It lives in the lines on your hands. It whispers in your dreams. It colors your fears, your love, your hunger, your quiet joy. You might not see it. You might not name it. But it's woven into your existence. A story embedded in blood. Consider this: the white picket dreams of your suburbs, the bricks of your home, the asphalt beneath your car tires. These are products of choices far older than you. Some roads were built by enslaved hands. Some cities sprang up on trauma. Some towns thrived because others were displaced. Every sunrise you see was painted by labor, some visible, some erased. Your lineage, genetic or adopted, inherits that legacy. Memories of forced marches, of surviving genocide, of crossing borders, of cooking mom's soup because no one else would. These stayed alive even when stories died. In your DNA, memory survives laboratory erasure. In your muscles, stories run like veins. The land remembers you. Walk barefoot on earth renovated by thousands of years of human care, native forest management, indigenous farming practiced in place for millennia. You might be barefoot in a city park, but that land is standing on centuries of hands guiding saplings, taming fires, building soil. The corn in your fridge, the beans, the squash, they were shaped by the Three Sisters garden of indigenous wisdom. Farmers bred seeds to thrive under sun and drought long before science named them hybrids. The memory of those seeds still pulses in every kernel. The stories you didn't know. You knew when you tell your child a bedtime story, a fairy tale. Maybe you're doing what humans have always done, passing wisdom disguised as myth. But imagine the tale of the proud squirrel, the clever fox. The unhappy king might whisper back to ancient mythologies carried across seas by ancestors who couldn't write, in rhythms of lullabies, chants, refrains. The memory hums in you. It carries discipline, resilience, sorrow, hope. You learned them before understanding. You repeat them after unknowingly remembering. Memory in the body. You know that feeling, heart racing during injustice. You taste it in your mouth. You feel it in your gut. That instinct is history alive in your body. It is collective trauma coded through generations. And it is also ancestral courage, because your ancestors survived wars, survived slavery, survived starvation, survived exile. Whoever came before you, regardless of their name, they passed you strength. Something is always breathing in you, even when your mind sleeps. You remember where you can't name the names of old cities. Cahokia, Tenochtitlan, Angkor echo faintly in your bones when you visit relatives or see skyline. When you drive past old churches built by fugitive slaves, or native sacred paths beneath highways. The places tell you stories happened here. Every step across a bridge, every sip from a river once navigated by canoes, every stone wall built by indentured labor. Each is memory, if you slow down enough to hear. History in everyday objects. The quilt on your bed, the songs on your playlist, the words you use, the recipes your family passes. These are time capsules. They carry scraps of identity, illness, rebellion, triumph. If you speak a word that puzzles your own mind like ritual, mass, bless you, you carry centuries of belief. If you snack on fried plantains, birria tacos, samosas, banh mi, you taste diasporas, journeys, fusion born of adaptation, of memory refusing to be forgotten, healing that knows you. You remember sadness, not quite your own, a grief tied to lost lands, to exile, to betrayal. It finds you in nights when your chest aches for no reason. That's history speaking beneath your skin. Healing begins when you listen. When you realize that your therapy, your tears, your healing retreats, they're part of a long tradition. From sweat lodges to journaling, from oil baths to talk circles, from shamanic journeys to therapy sessions, humans have been seeking restoration. And you are still part of that lineage. What you do with this breath tonight, as you prepare for sleep, let history wrap around you not as a burden, but as belonging. Let it be a quilt warmed by lineage, by courage, by the pulse of survival. Let it remind you that you are not alone in your fight for justice, your search for love, your fear of loss. You carry fire tenders, song learners, water guards, feast preparers. You carry those who spoke when silence was expected. You carry those who couldn't speak but whose bodies spoke for them. The sleep that remembers. As you lay your head down, let history be your lullaby. It isn't always gentle. It hums of shadows, of injustice, of trauma. But gentleness can grow from ashes. Your breath is part of that light. You will dream because you are remembered. Strange images, tunnels, trees, rivers are not random. They are echoes of ancestors, guideposts left in dream world for you to follow. You may not name the story. You may not need to. But tonight, as you drift into sleep, let it hold you, because history breathes in you. And when you rest, it rests too grateful that someone remembered.